The wind howled through the desolate hills, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Mark Ellison, a single father of 37, trudged along the narrow dirt path, his work boots crunching against the gravel. His daughter, Lily, 8 years old and small for her age, clung to his hand, her fingers cold despite the thick mittens she wore. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the rugged terrain. They were on their way back from the general store in town, a 30-minute hike from their isolated cabin in the Montana wilderness. Mark carried a backpack stuffed with canned goods and a new flashlight for Lily, who was terrified of the dark. The day had been ordinary, the kind of quiet routine Mark had built for them since his wife, Sarah, died 3 years ago in a car accident. He'd left his job as a mechanic in Bozeman, sold their house, and moved them out here to escape the memories that clung to every corner of their old life. The cabin was small, the life hard, but it was theirs. Lily was his anchor, her bright eyes and relentless curiosity keeping him grounded. Today, she'd been chattering about a bird she'd seen, a red-tailed hawk. She insisted when a sound cut through her words like a blade. It was a scream, raw and desperate, slicing through the stillness of the forest. Mark froze, his grip tightening on Lily's hand. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He held a finger to his lips, straining to listen. The scream came again, fainter but unmistakable, followed by a muffled cry that sounded like a child's. His heart thudded, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. The sound was coming from the old quarry, a half-mile off the path, abandoned for decades and rumored to be a dumping ground for things best left buried. "Stay here," Mark said, kneeling to meet Lily's wide, frightened eyes. "Hide behind that tree, okay? Don't move until I come back." She nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, and scurried behind a gnarled pine. Mark's pulse raced as he dropped the backpack and crept toward the quarry, moving low through the underbrush. The screams grew louder, more frantic, punctuated by the sound of shovels striking earth. He reached the edge of the quarry, a jagged scar in the landscape, and peered over the lip. Below, in a shallow pit, 2 figures were bound and gagged, a woman and a boy, no older than Lily. The woman's dark hair was matted with dirt, her eyes wild with terror as she thrashed against the ropes binding her wrists. The boy, small and frail, sobbed through his gag, his face streaked with tears. Above them stood 3 men, their faces obscured by ski masks. One held a shovel, scooping dirt and tossing it into the pit. The woman's muffled screams grew more desperate as the soil began to cover her legs. The other 2 men stood watch, one clutching a rifle, the other a pistol, their postures tense but deliberate. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to grab Lily and get as far away as possible. But the sight of the boy, so small, so like his own daughter, rooted him to the spot. He couldn't turn away. Not from this. His mind raced, calculating. He had no weapons, no phone signal out here, and the nearest sheriff's station was 20 miles away. The men were distracted, focused on their grim task, but they were armed, and he was one man. One wrong move, and he'd be dead and Lily would be alone. He scanned the quarry's edge, spotting a rusted metal pipe half buried in the dirt, about 3 feet long. It wasn't much, but it was something. He edged toward it, moving silently, his years of hunting with his father teaching him how to step without snapping twigs. His fingers closed around the cold, rough metal, and he tested its weight. Solid. Heavy enough to do damage. His stomach churned at the thought, but the woman's screams were growing weaker, the dirt now up to her waist. The boy was almost completely buried, only his head and shoulders visible, his cries reduced to choking gasps. Mark's mind flashed to Sarah, to the night he'd gotten the call about the accident. He'd been too late then, unable to save her. He wouldn't be too late now. He crept closer, staying low behind a pile of broken slate, his heart hammering so loud he was sure they'd hear it. The man with the shovel paused, wiping sweat from his brow, muttering something to the others. Mark caught fragments of their conversation. A broken bar, make sure no one finds them. A broken bar and a broken bar, boss said no loose ends. A broken bar, and his blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was planned, deliberate. And these men wouldn't hesitate to kill him if they spotted him. He weighed his options. He could try to take them by surprise, but 3 against 1, with guns, was suicide. He could wait, hope they left, and dig the woman and boy out after, but the dirt was piling up too fast. They didn't have time. His eyes darted to the quarry's edge, where a narrow path led down to the pit. If he could get close enough, maybe he could disable one of them, grab a gun, and even the odds. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He glanced back toward the tree where Lily hid, praying she'd stay put. Then, gripping the pipe, he started down the path, moving as quietly as he could. The men were arguing now, their voices rising, giving him cover. The one with the shovel gestured angrily, pointing at the pit. "Hurry up, we don't have all day," he snapped. Mark was halfway down when his boot dislodged a pebble, sending it skittering across the rock. The man with the rifle spun around, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked, raising the rifle. Mark flattened himself against the quarry wall, holding his breath. The man took a step toward the path, his flashlight beam cutting through the dusk. Mark's grip on the pipe tightened, his muscles coiled. If the man came closer, he'd have no choice but to act. The beam swept past him, inches from his face, and he felt the air burn in his lungs. The man hesitated, then turned back to the others. "Probably just a deer," he muttered. Mark exhaled silently, his heart pounding. He was close now, close enough to see the sweat on the woman's face, the way her eyes locked onto his for a fleeting moment, pleading. The boy was barely visible, the dirt up to his neck. Mark's stomach twisted. He had to move now. He edged closer, using a pile of rocks for cover, and raised the pipe. The man with the shovel was closest, his back to Mark, focused on his task. Mark took a deep breath, then lunged. The pipe connected with the man's skull with a sickening crunch, and he crumpled without a sound. The other two spun around, shouting, but Mark was already moving, diving behind a boulder as the man with the pistol fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt. Mark's ears rang, but he forced himself to stay focused. The woman was screaming again, her voice muffled but frantic, and the boy's head was almost completely covered. Mark's hands shook as he gripped the pipe, waiting for an opening. The man with the rifle advanced, sweeping the area with his flashlight. "Come out, you bastard!" he yelled. Mark's mind raced. He needed to draw them away from the pit, give himself a chance to free the woman and boy. He grabbed a rock and threw it hard, sending it clattering down the opposite side of the quarry. The man with the rifle turned, firing blindly into the shadows. Mark seized the moment, sprinting toward the pit. He dropped to his knees beside the woman, clawing at the dirt with his hands, trying to free her arms. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Her eyes were wide, her breathing ragged, but she nodded. The boy was still, too still, and Mark's heart lurched. He dug faster, his fingers scraping against the cold earth, uncovering the boy's face. He wasn't breathing. Mark tore the gag from the boy's mouth, tilting his head back, praying for a pulse. Nothing. He started chest compressions, his hands trembling, while the woman sobbed beside him. Footsteps crunched behind him, and Mark turned just in time to see the man with the pistol charging toward him. He swung the pipe, catching the man in the knee. The man screamed, collapsing, but the one with the rifle was closing in, his weapon raised. Mark grabbed the fallen pistol, his hands slick with sweat, and fired. The shot was wild, but it was enough to make the rifleman dive for cover. Mark kept digging, freeing the woman's arms, then her torso. She gasped, coughing up dirt, and helped him pull the boy free. The boy still wasn't breathing. Mark kept up the compressions, his arms burning, his vision blurring. "Come on, kid," he muttered, his voice breaking. The woman was sobbing, her hands shaking as she brushed dirt from the boy's face. Behind them, the rifleman shouted, his footsteps closing in. Mark's heart sank. He couldn't fight and save the boy at the same time. He looked at the woman, her face streaked with tears, and made a choice. "Take the gun," he said, shoving the pistol into her hands. "Cover me." She nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the weapon. Mark focused on the boy, counting compressions, willing him to breathe. The rifleman appeared at the edge of the pit, his weapon raised, but the woman fired, the shot echoing through the quarry. The man staggered, clutching his shoulder, and fell back. Mark didn't look up. He kept going, his hands moving mechanically, until finally, the boy gasped, a weak, shuddering breath. Relief flooded Mark, but there was no time to celebrate. The rifleman was back on his feet, blood dripping from his arm, and he was furious. Mark grabbed the boy, slinging him over his shoulder, and pulled the woman to her feet. "Run," he said, pointing toward the path. She hesitated, then took the boy, stumbling as she climbed out of the pit. Mark followed, the pipe still in his hand, ready to fight. They reached the top of the quarry, the woman clutching the boy, who was coughing but alive. Mark turned, scanning the darkness, but the rifleman was gone. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and the boy's ragged breaths. Mark's legs felt like lead, but he grabbed the woman's arm, urging her toward the tree where Lily hid. "We need to move," he said. "They'll come after us." They reached the tree, and Lily ran to him, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy!" she cried, throwing her arms around him. Mark held her tight, his heart breaking at the terror in her voice. The woman collapsed beside them, cradling the boy, who was starting to stir. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "You saved us." Mark didn't answer. His mind was racing, piecing together what he'd overheard. These men weren't random criminals. They were tied to something bigger, something that wanted this woman and her son dead. And now, Mark and Lily were in their crosshairs. He grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and helped the woman to her feet. "We need to get to my cabin," he said. "It's not far. We'll figure out what to do from there." They moved quickly, the woman carrying her son, Mark holding Lily's hand. The forest was dark now, the shadows swallowing them as they ran. Mark's mind churned with questions. Who were these people, and why were they targeted? But one thought drowned out the rest. He'd done what he had to, but at what cost? The men in the quarry weren't done. They'd come for them. And when they did, Mark wasn't sure he could protect his daughter. The cabin was a fortress of solitude, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense pines. Mark barred the door behind them, his hands still shaking from the quarry. The woman, who introduced herself as Claire, sat on the couch, her son, Ethan, curled against her. He was awake now, sipping water from a tin mug, his eyes haunted but alert. Lily sat beside Mark, her small hand gripping his, refusing to let go. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the room, but the warmth did little to ease the chill in Mark's bones. Claire's story came out in halting bursts. She was a journalist, she said, working on a story about a local mining company tied to illegal dumping and corruption. She'd gotten too close, uncovered names and documents that powerful people wanted buried. Ethan, her 9-year-old son, had been with her when she'd received a threat. To a note slipped under her door, promising death if she didn't stop. She'd gone to the police, but they dismissed her, claiming it was a prank. 2 days ago, men had broken into her home, tied them up, and driven them to the quarry. She didn't know who they were, only that they'd been paid to make her disappear. Mark listened, his jaw tight. He'd heard rumors about the mining company, whispers in town about payoffs and accidents swept under the rug. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. He glanced at Lily, who was watching Claire with wide eyes, and felt a surge of protectiveness. He'd brought her out here to keep her safe, to give her a life free from pain. Now, he'd dragged her into something far worse. "We can't stay here," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They'll find us. They know I'm alive, and they won't stop." Mark nodded, his mind racing. The cabin was defensible, but not against men with guns and a vendetta. The nearest town was too far, and the sheriff's department was likely compromised if Claire's story was true. His truck was parked out back, but the roads were narrow, easy to ambush. They were trapped. A sound outside made them all freeze. A low, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. Mark grabbed the pistol he'd taken from the quarry, motioning for Claire to get down. He crept to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The moonlight revealed a figure moving through the trees, slow and deliberate, a rifle glinting in his hands. It was the man from the quarry, the one Claire had shot. He wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged, their silhouettes dark against the snow-dusted ground. Mark's heart sank. They were surrounded. He turned to Claire, his voice low. "Take the kids to the bedroom. Barricade the door." She nodded, grabbing Ethan and Lily and hurrying to the back of the cabin. Mark gripped the pistol, his palms sweaty, and took position behind the door. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for this, but he'd do whatever it took to protect his daughter. The first man kicked the door, the wood splintering but holding. Mark fired through the gap, the shot deafening in the small space. A grunt of pain followed, and the man fell back. But the others were moving, circling the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Mark's mind raced. He needed a plan, something to turn the odds in their favor. His eyes landed on the propane tank by the stove, a half-formed idea taking shape. He ran to the kitchen, grabbing a can of gasoline he kept for the generator. The men were shouting now, their voices angry, coordinated. They weren't going to leave. Mark unscrewed the cap, splashing gasoline across the floor, leading a trail to the propane tank. His hands shook as he worked, the acrid smell burning his nose. This was insane, but it was their only chance. He grabbed a matchbook from the counter, his heart pounding. The door burst open, and the rifleman stormed in, his weapon raised. Mark struck the match, tossing it onto the gasoline. Flames erupted, racing across the floor, catching the man off guard. He screamed, stumbling back as the fire spread. Mark didn't wait. He ran to the bedroom, grabbing Clara and the kids, and led them out the back window. The cabin was burning now, the flames licking the walls, the heat searing his skin. They stumbled into the forest, the kids crying, Claire clutching Ethan. Behind them, the cabin was a blaze of light, the men's shouts swallowed by the roar of the fire. Mark didn't know if they'd escaped or if they were still coming. He didn't stop to find out. He led them deeper into the woods, his arm around Lily, his mind racing with one thought: keep them alive. The town would talk about it for years. So the single father who burned his own cabin to save a woman and her son, the flames that lit up the night, the men who vanished into the wilderness. Some called him a hero. Others whispered he'd gone too far, that no man could do what he did and stay sane. Mark didn't care. He'd saved them. But as he looked at Lily's tear-streaked face, he knew the cost was more than a cabin. He'd brought her into a world of danger, and now, they could never go back. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, the moonlight barely piercing the dense canopy of pines as Mark led Claire, Ethan, and Lily deeper into the wilderness. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, the distant crackle of the burning cabin fading behind them. Mark's heart pounded, his breath visible in the frigid night. But he didn't dare slow down. The men from the quarry or whoever they worked for wouldn't stop. Not after what he'd done. He'd set his home ablaze, a desperate act to buy them time, but it had painted a target on their backs. The flames would draw attention, and not just from their pursuers. The town would come looking, and with them, questions Mark wasn't ready to answer. Lily clung to his hand, her small fingers trembling despite the mittens he'd pulled from his pocket. Her eyes, wide and glassy, darted toward every rustle in the underbrush, and Mark's chest ached at the fear etched into her face. She was only 8, too young for this nightmare, but he dragged her into it. Claire carried Ethan, who was still weak from the ordeal in the quarry, his thin frame shivering against her. She moved with grim determination, her journalist's instincts sharpened by survival, but her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. They were alive. But for how long? Mark's mind raced as he navigated the familiar trails, his years in these woods giving him an edge. The cabin was gone, but he knew a place they could hide. A hunter's blind he'd built years ago, tucked into a ravine a mile north. It wasn't much, just a camouflaged lean-to with a tarp roof, but it would shield them from the wind and prying eyes. He glanced back at Claire, her breath ragged as she struggled to keep up, Ethan's weight slowing her down. "Almost there," he whispered, hoping his voice carried more confidence than he felt. The blind was nestled against a rocky outcrop, hidden by a tangle of brambles. Mark pushed aside the branches, ushering them inside. The space was cramped, the air damp and heavy with the scent of moss, but it was dry. He pulled a tattered blanket from his backpack, wrapping it around Lily and Ethan, who huddled together on the dirt floor. Claire sank beside them, her hands shaking as she brushed Ethan's hair from his face. "They'll find us," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "They always do." Mark crouched beside her, the stolen pistol heavy in his jacket pocket. "Not tonight," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He'd bought them time, but the men from the quarry were professionals, a hired muscle, Claire had said, working for someone with deep pockets and deeper secrets. The mining company she'd been investigating wasn't just dumping chemicals, it was tied to a network of corruption that reached into the state capital, maybe higher. Claire's notes, hidden in a safe deposit box in Bozeman, were their only leverage, but getting them meant crossing open country with killers on their trail. He peered through a gap in the tarp, scanning the darkness. The forest was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl, but the quiet felt deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Lily's soft whimper pulled him back, and he knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "It's okay, Bug," he said, forcing a smile. "We're just camping, like we used to with Grandpa." She nodded, clutching Mr. Whiskers, her stuffed rabbit, but her eyes told him she wasn't fooled. She'd seen too much, heard too much. The innocence he'd fought to protect was slipping away, and it gutted him. Claire's voice broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "You could have walked away." "You had her to think about." She nodded toward Lily, her expression a mix of gratitude and accusation. Mark's jaw tightened. He'd asked himself the same question 100 times since the quarry. Why hadn't he kept walking, kept Lily safe? But the memory of Ethan's face, buried to his neck in dirt, had seared itself into his mind. He couldn't have left them, not after losing Sarah, not after failing her. "I couldn't let them die," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not when I could do something." Claire studied him, then nodded, as if she understood the weight of guilt that drove him. Ethan stirred, his voice weak. "Are they gone, Mum?" Claire pulled him closer, kissing his forehead. "They're not here now," she said, but her eyes flicked to Mark, and he saw the same fear he felt. They weren't safe, not yet. Mark rummaged through his backpack, pulling out the last of their supply, so a few granola bars, a half-empty water bottle, and the new flashlight he'd bought for Lily. He handed the bars to Claire, who split one between the kids. "Eat slow," she told them. "We don't know how long we'll be here." Mark checked the pistol, counting the rounds. 5 left. Not enough if the men came in force. He needed a plan, but his mind kept circling back to the fire. He'd burned his home, their sanctuary, to save strangers. The town would call it madness. Maybe worse. He could already hear the whispers once table, dangerous, a man unhinged by grief. The crack of a branch outside snapped him to attention. He motioned for silence, gripping the pistol as he crept to the edge of the blind. The forest was still, but his gut told him they weren't alone. He waited, his breath shallow, until a shadow moved to a man, tall and broad, easing through the trees with a rifle slung across his chest. Mark's heart sank. It was the rifleman from the quarry, the one Claire had wounded. The bandage on his shoulder gleamed white in the moonlight, but he moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the ground. He was tracking them. Mark signaled for Claire to stay low, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun him, not with 2 kids and Claire's exhaustion. Fighting was a last resort. 5 bullets against a rifle wasn't a fair match. He needed to outsmart him. His eyes fell on the ravine's edge, where loose rocks teetered above a steep drop. An idea formed, risky but possible. He whispered to Claire, "Keep them quiet. I'll lead him away." She grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "You don't have to do this. We can hide." "No," he said, his voice firm. "He's too close. If he finds us, we're done." She hesitated, then nodded, pulling Ethan and Lily closer. Mark slipped out of the blind, moving low, his boots silent on the mossy ground. He picked up a stone and tossed it toward the ravine, the clatter echoing through the trees. The rifleman's head snapped toward the sound, and he started moving, his steps deliberate. Mark circled wide, keeping to the shadows, his heart pounding as he lured the man toward the trap. The rifleman was cautious, pausing to listen, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Mark threw another stone, this one closer to the ravine's edge. The man followed, his rifle raised, unaware of the unstable ground beneath him. Mark's breath hitched as he crept closer, gripping the metal pipe he'd kept from the quarry. He needed to get the man off balance, just for a moment. He waited until the rifleman was near the edge, then lunged, swinging the pipe at his legs. The man grunted, stumbling, but he was faster than Mark expected. He spun, the rifle swinging toward Mark's chest. Mark dove to the side, the shot ringing out, the bullet grazing his arm. Pain seared through him, but he kept moving, tackling the man's legs. They hit the ground hard, the rifle skidding across the dirt. The man was strong, his fists hammering Mark's back, but Mark held on, driving his elbow into the man's wounded shoulder. The rifleman roared in pain, giving Mark the chance to roll free and grab the rifle. He stood, panting, the weapon heavy in his hands. The rifleman glared up at him, blood seeping through his bandage, his eyes burning with rage. "You're a dead man," he spat. "You and that kid of yours." Mark's blood ran cold. They knew about Lily. He didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle's butt, knocking the man out cold, then dragged him to the ravine's edge. With a heave, he pushed the body over, watching it tumble into the darkness below. His stomach churned, but he couldn't afford mercy. Not now. He returned to the blind, his arm throbbing, blood soaking his sleeve. Claire's eyes widened, but she didn't ask questions. "We need to move," Mark said, his voice hoarse. He wasn't alone. He helped them up, ignoring the pain, and led them deeper into the forest, toward a creek he knew ran west. If they could reach it, they could follow it to a logging road, maybe flag down help. It was a long shot, but staying still wasn't an option. The night stretched on, the cold biting through their clothes. Lily was quiet now, her small body pressed against him, and Ethan clung to Claire, his coughs growing weaker. Mark's arm burned, the wound deeper than he'd thought, but he pushed through, his mind focused on one thing, keeping them alive. Dawn was breaking when they reached the creek, its icy water glinting in the first light. Mark knelt, splashing his face, the cold shocking him awake. He checked the rifle. 3 rounds left. Better than the pistol, but still not enough. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "What now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Mark looked at the kids, their faces pale and exhausted, and felt the weight of his choices. He'd saved them from the quarry, but at what cost? His home was gone, his daughter was traumatized, and they were still hunted. "We keep moving," he said. "There's a road a few miles west. If we're lucky, we'll find someone before they find us." They followed the creek, the terrain growing rougher, the air colder. Mark carried Lily when her legs gave out, her weight a comfort despite the pain in his arm. Claire carried Ethan, her strength fading but her resolve unbroken. The forest was silent, but Mark's instincts screamed that they were being watched. He kept the rifle ready, his eyes scanning the trees. When the first shot rang out, he reacted on instinct, shoving Claire and the kids behind a boulder. The bullet had come from the south, kicking up dirt near his feet. Mark peered over the boulder, spotting 2 figures moving through the trees. New men, not the ones from the quarry. Reinforcements. His heart sank. They were organized, relentless, and they knew exactly where to look. He fired a shot, more to scare than to hit, and pulled the group back, retreating along the creek. "Stay low," he hissed, his voice urgent. Claire nodded, her face grim as she clutched the pistol he'd given her. They moved as fast as they could, the kids stumbling but silent, sensing the danger. The men were closing in, their footsteps heavy, their voices low but audible. Spread out, one said. They can't be far. Mark's mind raced. The logging road was still too far, and the kids were slowing them down. He needed to buy time, to create a diversion. His eyes fell on the creek, its banks steep and muddy. An idea formed, desperate but possible. "Claire," he whispered, pulling her close. "Take the kids and follow the creek. Don't stop until you reach the road. I'll draw them off." Her eyes widened, fear and protest mixing in her gaze. "No," she said. "You can't." He cut her off, his voice firm. "I'm not asking. Get them out of here." He pressed the rifle into her hands, keeping the pistol for himself. She hesitated, tears welling, then nodded, pulling Ethan and Lily toward the creek. Mark waited until they were out of sight, then moved in the opposite direction, making noisy snapping branches, kicking rocks. The men took the bait, their footsteps turning toward him. He ran, his arms screaming with pain, his lungs burning. The forest blurred around him as he led them away from the creek, deeper into the wilderness. Shots rang out, bullets tearing through the trees, but he kept moving, zigzagging to avoid their aim. His foot caught on a root, and he fell, the pistol skidding from his hand. He scrambled for it, but a boot slammed into his back, pinning him to the ground. "Got you?" a voice growled. Mark twisted, seeing a man in a black jacket, his face hard and unshaven, a pistol aimed at Mark's head. Another man joined him, younger, with a scar across his cheek. "Where's the woman?" the first man demanded. Mark spat dirt, his mind racing. He needed to keep them talking. "Give Claire time." "Gone," he said, his voice steady. "You'll never find her." The man's eyes narrowed, and he raised the pistol, but the younger one grabbed his arm. "Boss wants him alive. He knows too much." Mark's blood ran cold. They weren't just after Claire, they wanted him now, too. He'd seen their faces, heard their plans. He was a loose end. The older man grunted, lowering the gun, and hauled Mark to his feet, binding his wrists with zip ties. "Move," he said, shoving Mark forward. They marched him through the forest, the younger man trailing behind, his gun trained on Mark's back. Mark's mind churned, searching for a way out. His arm throbbed, his strength fading, but he thought of Lily, of her small hand in his, and pushed forward. They reached a clearing where a black SUV waited, its engine idling. The older man opened the back door, shoving Mark inside. "You're gonna tell us everything," he said, climbing in beside him, "or we'll find that kid of yours and make you watch." Mark's vision darkened with rage, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to stay alive, to find a way back to Lily. The SUV started moving, bouncing over rough terrain, and Mark's eyes darted to the door. The lock was engaged, but the window was cracked open, just enough. He waited, counting the seconds, until the driver hit a rut, the vehicle lurching. Mark lunged, slamming his shoulder into the older man, and kicked the door open. He threw himself out, hitting the ground hard, rolling into the underbrush. Shouts erupted behind him, bullets tearing through the trees, but Mark was already running, his bound hands making every step clumsy. Pain radiated through his body, but he didn't stop, weaving through the forest, heading back toward the creek. He had to find Lily, had to make sure Clara and Ethan made it to the road. The men were close, their voices echoing, but the forest was his domain. He knew every trail, every hiding spot. He dove behind a fallen log, holding his breath as the men passed, their flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. When they were gone, he stumbled to his feet, his hands still bound, and ran toward the creek. Dawn was breaking, the sky a pale gray, and he prayed Claire had made it. He reached the logging road just as a pickup truck crawled into view, its headlights blinding. Mark froze, expecting the worst, but the driver was an old man, a local logger Mark recognized from town. "Ellison?" the man called, leaning out the window. "What the hell's going on?" Mark's knees buckled, relief flooding him. "Help," he gasped. "My daughter, she's with a woman and a boy. They're in danger." The logger didn't hesitate, helping Mark into the truck and cutting his zip ties. They sped down the road, and within minutes, Mark spotted Thea, Claire, Lily, and Ethan, huddled at the roadside, waving frantically. Lily ran to him, sobbing, and Mark held her tight, his own tears falling.